Okay, it's Mr. Cannon here again, and today we're going to be looking at the civil rights movement. We don't have enough time to look in depth at every single aspect of the movement, but we're going to give an overview of the civil rights movement and some of the main events that occurred and the main players that made the movement really progress and work. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. All right, so let's start with post-World War II America. Now, it's not like the civil rights movement just happened spontaneously and it happened all of a sudden starting in the 1950s. The civil rights movement goes all the way back to the end of the Civil War. And we had Reconstruction and the Reconstruction Amendments. And we saw the 13th Amendment banned slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship rights to all people born in America. And the 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote regardless of race. But we also know that after Reconstruction, we began to see things like Jim Crow laws be put into place that took away some of those freedoms and rights that were guaranteed by the Constitution. So even though the Constitution guaranteed it, it wasn't being put into practice. And the Supreme Court actually had ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that segregation was legal as long as it was equal. You could be separate as long as it was equal. Well, it wasn't equal. What we know is that things were not equal. And so we fast forward through the decades, and we're going to have a lot of pushes by people in America, especially groups like the NAACP, are going to push for change. That change is going to be very slow to progress, but we're going to start seeing it really ramp up after World War II in America. And the reason for that is as African Americans began to come home from the war, they began to experience the same discrimination that they experienced before. And these are people that have put their life on the line for America to save America from the Nazis. And they're being treated as second-class citizens when they get home. On top of that, African Americans who remained at home and began working in factory jobs to produce for the war are going to be removed from those jobs, and whites who come back home from the war are going to be given those jobs. So losing jobs, soldiers being treated as second-class citizens, the fact that the military was still segregated even though you're fighting and dying just the way white soldiers were, are going to bring more of a push by these African American young people for change. They're going to push more and more for change. But we also need to be clear that it wasn't like this was the first push. This had been coming for decades before. So people who had pushed for these changes before, people like Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, those people deserve lots of credit for what they did in the decades before the actual civil rights movement took place. Now, what's going to happen as well is we're going to see lynchings are going to continue in America into the 1940s. And some of these soldiers who come home are going to bring this to light. Lynchings, the fact that African Americans in the 1940s are still being tied up and beaten and hanged, killed based on their race is something that is going to be brought to more public attention during this period. You had the Emmett Till situation. Emmett Till was a young African American man, or actually young, he wasn't even a man, he was a boy. He was, I think, 14 years old, who was visiting family down in Mississippi. He was from Chicago, but visiting down with family in Mississippi, and he was accused of whistling at a white girl. And as a result, he's going to be uh, beaten. He's going to be severely flogged and murdered savagely. His remains it was terrible. What they did to him was absolutely terrible. And this was a boy who did nothing more than supposedly whistle at a white woman. His mom is going to have the body brought back to Chicago where she's going to put it on display for people to see what had happened to her son in America. This is supposed to be the land of the free. In the 1940s, this happened to her son in America. And so situations like that are going to help fuel the push for change. One of the first presidents we're going to see really delve into this matter is President Truman. After the war, he's going to establish a civil rights commission to examine the case of lynchings in America. And as a result, we are going to start to see lynchings decrease. Now, they had already decreased some. They had gone down from the 1910s to the 20s to the 30s, but we still had them in the 40s. But we're going to start to see that decrease even more to where they became non-existent. This is also going to be our politicians are going to see these events, things like lynchings and the discrimination occurring in America, as a real black eye to us globally. Here we are trying to present ourselves after World War II as a model for the world. We're trying to be a leader for the free world in a fight against communism, but here we are facing embarrassment within our own country because of our own racist policies. So that's going to help fuel this change as well. One of the big victories early in the civil rights movement is going to occur in 1954 with a Supreme Court decision called Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. And what this case is going to be about is the inequality of schools in America. Now, you're actually going to have several cases being brought all throughout the country all at the same time. One of those cases was in South Carolina. It was called Briggs versus Elliott, where you had a young African-American girl whose family sued the school district in Clarendon County because they provided buses for white schools, but they did not provide buses for African American schools. So this young lady was having to walk a ridiculous amount past a white school just to go to her school. So they sued. Well, you had lawsuits all over the country like this. The NAACP really pushed a lot of these lawsuits. And what's going to happen is they're all going to get lumped in to one big decision. And that decision came out of Kansas. The Supreme Court is going to take this case out of Kansas, and it's going to make a broad ruling that's going to affect everyone in America. And that ruling was that segregation was illegal in public schools, that you could no longer segregate based on race in public schools. And the Supreme Court ruled in 1954 that local communities and states had to adjust to this with all deliberate speed. In other words, they had to integrate schools as quickly as possible. Now, the truth is they did not. Many states and many local communities in the South slow played this. They went as slowly as they could. So even though this decision was in 1954, some school districts in parts of the South aren't going to integrate until the early 70s. So you can see it's going to take, 15, 20, and 30 years in some cases for this decision to actually take effect. But it was a huge decision. It was an important decision because it is going to set the stage for ending segregation in other places. It started in the schools, though. And you can see there the photograph there of the African-American girl in this classroom that's filled with white students. That's what's going to start happening all throughout the country. These all-white schools are going to have people, African Americans who live in those districts, are going to start going to those schools. My own father-in-law was telling me a story of his high school, Spartanburg High School, how he was in school in the 1960s when the first African American students came to his school. In some places in America, those interactions became violent, and the military, the National Guard, actually had to be called in. In this particular case, in a lot of cases, they weren't violent. And my father-in-law was telling me that it was a big deal, but nothing really happened. Nothing bad happened as a result of it. African American students came to the school, and the school adjusted and moved on. And so we had some cases like that, and we had other cases where these schools had a lot of violence in them. If you've seen the movie Remember the Titans, what a great movie to show the integration of schools in America. And that was one of the last schools, that story is one of the last schools that actually did integrate. They tried to slow it up as much as possible and not do so. Okay, one of the trademarks of the civil rights movement is going to be the use of civil disobedience in the protest for change. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be a leader of this movement, and he really preached nonviolence in all interactions over civil rights. What we mean by nonviolence is the type of protest where you have like sit-ins. Okay, so the photograph there shows a group of young African American male students. They go to this lunch counter that served whites only. So they didn't serve African Americans. So what these young men did is they would go and sit at that lunch counter and they would ask to be served. And of course, the sign would say whites only, and so they would just sit there, taking up those spaces. Now, eventually, what was happening is the police would be called in and they would be escorted and actually arrested and taken out of the restaurant or the lunch counter. But in the meantime, if you would go do that at a very crowded time, that business, by not serving those gentlemen, actually were losing customers because they were taking up seats and were refusing to move. And so it would take a while for the police to actually come in and arrest them. And they would do it at some of the busiest times during the lunch hour when that restaurant may have people come in. And so this was a form of protest. It was peaceful and yet it was effective because the restaurants were, getting frustrated. They were losing money through this. And the idea was to bring this injustice to light. Another type of civil disobedience would be a boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott is an example of this. So the story of Rosa Parks, African Americans were supposed to sit at the back of the bus. If a white came on the bus and wanted that seat, African Americans were supposed to move to the back. Rosa Parks refused to move. She was arrested. This was all set up on purpose by the leaders of the movement so that they could launch what was called the Montgomery bus boycott, where African Americans and some whites who supported the movement refused to buy bus tickets. Well, of course, by boycotting and refusing to buy those tickets, the bus companies were struggling and were hurting financially and eventually caved in and gave in to the movement. That's another example of how you use a nonviolent protest to enact change. Freedom rides, where you'd have rides all over the country. They were called freedom rides. You'd have marches all over the country, protests, which this was the time of television. And television played such a huge role in this, guys, because as you see these images of people protesting peacefully, marching peacefully, you can juxtapose that with images of some, not all, but some white police officers, white citizens attacking these peaceful protests. And because television was coming into everyone's home at this time, most people had televisions, now they could see these images of these interactions. And of course, you had a clear good side and bad side. Peaceful protesters being beaten because they're protesting peacefully. The protesters are the good side, and the ones doing the beating are obviously the bad side. And most Americans, when they saw these images, they said, this has to stop. This has to change. So these peaceful protests were very, very effective, and television was a big part of that, showing just the brutality of Jim Crow in parts of America. Now, I want to be clear. We didn't have violence over peaceful protests in every town and city in the South. Many times you did not have that, but there were instances where there were. And African American leaders like Dr. King actually were very strategic about where they had these protests and these marches. They would intentionally go into communities where they knew that the chief of police was a blatant racist and was going to react violently and tell the people under him to react violently. They would intentionally go there because that's what the images that they wanted to show on television was the images of these racist, violent people targeting innocent people. So it was a very, very effective protest. All right, another big signature moment of the civil rights movement is the March on Washington. Now, we're going to have two marches on Washington. The first was during the Great Depression and the New Deal, and that march was over jobs and the fact that the New Deal wasn't providing quality jobs for African Americans. Well, this March on Washington is the one that most people think of, and it happened during the Civil Rights Movement in 1963. It's organized by by Dr. King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Dr. King is going to end the march with a speech. It's a very famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech, where he lays out the actual dream and purpose of the movement. And as people hear this speech, not just there in Washington, but around the country, as they're watching on the news, it really tugs at people's hearts. They're like, you know what? This is absolutely the story of America, that we should all be treated equally. And so the I Have a Dream speech was very effective for that reason. Now we know that over time, Dr. King is going to lead lots of marches and make lots of speeches and is going to really do a fantastic job as leader of the movement, but eventually he is going to be assassinated. He's going to be assassinated and his voice is going to be missed greatly by the movement. All right, two very important laws that are going to be passed during the Civil Rights Movement. There were several, but two of the most important were called the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to discriminate in any public place based on race. So these restaurants that were saying that they won't serve African Americans, the Civil Rights Act made that illegal. You could not discriminate based on race. You couldn't refuse service based on race. Separate restrooms, that's going to go away as a result. Separate facilities, water fountains, all of that's going to go away. In other words, the Jim Crow South is going to be demolished partly by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. On top of that, we're going to have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and what this act did is it's going to say that things like poll taxes and literacy tests and the grandfather clauses, all of those things are illegal and are going to be thrown out. In other words, anything that is trying to take away people's right to vote, especially we're talking about African Americans' right to vote, that's going to be thrown out. The 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, which grants all people the right to vote, 15th, all men the right to vote, the 19th, women the right to vote, those are going to be in full effect, and that's what the Voting Rights Act is going to start enforcing, is the idea that people have the right to vote, and that right to vote cannot be taken away. You can see there, I think that's Lyndon Johnson. That is one of our presidents who he was president after John F. Kennedy. Kennedy's assassinated. Lyndon Johnson becomes president, and he's going to sign these pieces of legislation. He was very big achievements of his presidency is signing the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. You can see there Dr. King in the background as one of these acts are being signed. It was a big deal. Okay, as we move further into from the 50s and early 60s into the late 60s, mid and late 60s, we're going to see a separate movement start to occur within the civil rights movement, or actually it's actually separate from the civil rights movement, and it was called the Black Power movement. This was a movement led partly by Malcolm X. He's not the only leader, but he was one of them. This is going to be primarily northern and urban city living African American young men who are going to start distancing themselves from the nonviolent southern protesters. So the protests that were led by Dr. King that were nonviolent, this group is going to sort of separate themselves from that. They're going to push more. Their idea is that you use any means necessary to bring equality. Any means necessary means even fighting back. If you are like one of Dr. King's big things was when they would go into these communities where they knew they could possibly be attacked, they would instill it in all the protesters, do not attack back. So you have these images of people being beaten and just taking it, just being beaten and doing nothing about it. Well, that was very effective because people saw that and saw how unjust that was. Malcolm X and the Black Power movement said, no, that is not the way to go. If you are in any way threatened or attacked even if it's by the authorities, you fight back. And so it's using any means necessary. The rhetoric, the words used by Malcolm X were more violent. They tended to be more violent. They tended to be stronger wording, and it turned a lot of white Americans off. And so you're going to see the movement lose support. This part of the movement is going to lose support among a lot of people in other parts of the country. And there are going to be some African Americans too. Plenty of African Americans that were part of the peaceful protests that are not going to agree with this part of the movement either. But it's a pretty complicated story that you should certainly research for yourself. We see a lot of the issues even today from the civil rights movement. We still have issues in America that we're dealing with, but we did have a lot of what we call de jure racism and segregation. De jure means by law. The civil rights movement is really going to do an effective job of ending legal segregation and legal racist policies. They're going to be thrown out by the movement. The movement is going to pass laws that make that illegal. What it's not going to be as effective in doing is getting rid of de facto segregation and de facto racism, and that is not by law, but just in reality. It's more subtle. It's harder to put your finger on, but examples like white flight, where you would have whites leaving the cities and going to the suburbs and making communities that were primarily white, that is an example of not by law segregation, but by fact segregation. And that's something that we still deal with today, is racism and segregation that aren't legal, that aren't in fact legal in America, but it's just a part of our social fabric. And we've been fighting against it. We've made progress, but we still have certainly more progress to make. And there are different ways to do that, and there are different thoughts about how we're going to do that. And that's what my generation, and especially your generation, we're going to have to figure out what's the best way to come together and be one America, where we aren't separated by race and creed and things like that.